The Montana Festival of the Book would not be possible without the assistance of numerous individuals and organizations. I would like to thank first the more than 140 writers and panelists who are appearing at this year's festival. Many of them have traveled great distances. All of them are here for their love and commitment to their art and to their readers, and we sincerely appreciate their effort for the festival. Among the organizations that support us are, of course, our parent, the National Endowment for the Humanities, but also the Paul G. Allen Family Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Montana Arts Council, and of course, the Missoulian. Many other local individuals, merchants, and organizations listed on this evening's program support the festival in a great variety of ways. And to them, we also are most grateful. Special among them are the 4 Missoula bookstores, Fact and Fiction downtown and on campus, Shakespeare and Company, and Barnes & Noble, who all constitute the festival bookstore and join together every year to work on this event. Tonight's gala readers will be available for signing and conversation in the theater lobby at the conclusion of this evening's performance. Their books will be there on sale also. The Montana Festival of the Book would not be possible without the devotion and work of the staff of Humanities Montana, Ken Stoltz, Claire Leonard, and especially this year, Festival Coordinator Judy Klein. Please give them a round of applause. In addition, the festival's artist in residence, Susan Carlson, helps us immensely with the festival every year, tries to make us look a little better. And we are grateful for our student staffers, Shannon O'Leary and Erica Blau, whose dedication and hard work were just tremendous this year. A number of wonderful volunteers do important work for the festival, most notably nearly all of our 19 board members who have traveled here from across the state. They and our other volunteers also have our sincere gratitude. And lastly, we thank readers like you who support the festival with your attendance and your generous donations. We will thank you ever more if you make just one more stop by the donation box this evening in the lobby. It is with sadness every year that we note the passing of members of Montana's literary community. This year, 2 particular friends of the festival and of literature left us. Lenny Holloman, who is the voice of literature and the humanities on Montana Public Radio and Yellowstone Public Radio, and who taped and created amazing programs based on the highlights of the festival every year since our inception, passed away earlier this year. We miss her amazing programs and her beaming face and booming laugh, especially these past 2 days. And one of Montana's leading writers, the great James Crumley, passed away last month. For many readers across the world, Montana is the slightly surreal, funny, and heartbreaking place described in Jim's books. We are the poorer now without both of them. But tonight we celebrate the wealth that we have here, the generosity and the wisdom. It is now my pleasure to welcome one of the great warriors for the humanities in our nation, Senior Fellow at the Rocky Mountain Center for the West, and former U.S. Representative Pat Williams.
Hey, thank you. Welcome to this first evening of the festival. Thank you, Kim. I have the high honor of introducing an old friend to Missoula and to Montana, and an old friend to the wild places, Rick Bass. Rick is the author of 24 books of fact and fiction. His latest, Why I Came West, is wonderful. If you haven't gotten that far down the pile yet, hurry. and read it. He has a forthcoming book called The Wild Marsh, 4 Seasons at Home in Montana. Rick won the Penn Nelson citation for fiction. But perhaps there's something with regard to us here tonight that's more important about Rick, and that is that he and Elizabeth, his wife, have moved, at least temporarily, from his beloved Yak up in northwestern Montana to Missoula. Yeah. And they did so for the right reason, I think, for their 2 daughters, Mary Catherine and Lowry, who wanted to try a bigger town than the Yak. And just for variety's sake, they wanted to try different schools. And Elizabeth and Rick thought that was the best reason in the world to leave a land they loved for a city they admire, and I think are having a good time in. So when you see Rick and the kids and Elizabeth on the street, stop them, tell them you're glad they're here, and you can do it right now by welcoming Rick Bass.
Thank you, Pat. Can you guys hear me in the back? Great. Thank you all so much for welcoming us here to Missoula. The schools are lovely and the people are lovely. I haven't figured it out yet. I mean, half the time it's really invigorating and fun, and the other half of the time it's noisy and loud and crowded. And we're happy to be here, and thank you guys for having us. I'll get it figured out in a bit. I'm going to read a short story tonight, but before I do that, I want to say some thank yous to the festival for having me here, and to Pat for introducing me this evening. For 21 years, I've lived up in the Yak and worked for protecting wilderness up there, and for what feels like 20 and a half years, Pat's been the only leader, the only politician who's listened to me. And Kim used the word warrior, and he is an utter warrior. I just can't say enough about him. I'm so grateful to I've always been grateful to his attention to the Yak. No politician is ever going to get elected or re-elected or unelected based on the Yak. And Pat does it because his heart is huge. He does it because he doesn't take shit from anybody, and because he's compassionate. And I mean, what more could we want in a Democrat?
I'm also so honored to be here with Kim and Bob this evening, and with Tom, who essentially with Jim Harrison taught me how to write fiction and made me believe that it was a wonderful life worth pursuing. And I could talk all night, but I owe Tom and Jim the joy and agony of pursuing a life writing fiction. And I'm grateful to you, and damn you. A little bit of unfinished business with the Yak. Again, Pat just doesn't quit. He was doing a fundraiser. I've got a friend up there, a hunting guide. He's this incredibly moderate Democrat, much too moderate for my liking, but he's still a sweet man. And I can't do anything gracefully or efficiently. Like, this is probably even illegal or something to be on humanity's time clock. But I've got some donation envelopes. Pat's been helping me fundraise for this great Democratic House candidate up in the northwest corner, total Republican enclave, total arch-conservative enclave. And Tim, my friend, the hunting guide, is running on a platform of good ideas don't have to be Republican or Democratic. They just need to be good for the state. He's a sweet man. If any of you are interested in supporting him, come talk to me after the reading. The Montana Humanities Council has nothing to do with this. Pat Williams and I are working on this one. Crumley, the last time I was here, we were downstairs and had a couple of drinks, and then came up to read. And I've been thinking about this a lot. Of course he's missed, but I'm not sure he's gone away. I think we're just not going to see him as often as we did. And I certainly think he's here this evening. Before I start reading, I want to thank the Thisted brothers in the Ninemile Valley for their work with the wolves. This idea of one person making a difference, whether it's Pat Williams or the 3,400 people who elected John Tester, the 3,400 who signed up in Missoula the day of the election. Every one of us makes a huge difference. It's a thrilling time of history to be alive. And this story is somewhat in that vein. And also my thanks to our friend Lynn who helped me conceive this story. It's called Her First Elk. She'd killed an elk once. She'd been a young woman just out of college, her beloved father already 3 years in the grave, and had set out early on opening morning, hiking uphill through a forest of huge ponderosa pines, with the stars shining like sparks through their boughs, and owls calling all around her, and her breath rising strong in puffs and clouds as she climbed, and a shimmering at the edge of her vision like the electricity in the night sky that sometimes precedes the arrival of the northern lights or heat lightning. The hunt was over astonishingly quickly. Years later, she would realize that the best hunts stretch out 4 or 5 weeks and sometimes never result in a taking. But this one had ended in the first hour, on the first day. Even before daylight, she had caught the scent of the herd bedded down just ahead of her, a scent sweeter and ranker than that of any number of stabled horses. And creeping closer, she had been able to hear their herd sounds, their little mewings and grunts. She crouched behind one of the giant trees, shivering from both the cold and her excitement. Slowly, the day became light, and she sank lower into the tall grass beneath the big pines, the scent of the grass sweet upon her skin. And the lighter the day became, the farther she flattened herself down into that yellow grass. The elk rose to their feet just ahead of her, and at first she thought they had somehow scented her, even though the faint breeze in her face was carrying the ripe scent of the herd downhill straight to her. But they were only grazing, wandering around now, still clucking and barking and coughing, and feeding on the same sweet-scented grass that she was hiding in. She could hear their teeth grinding as they chewed, could hear the clicking of their hooves as they brushed against rocks. These creatures seemed a long way from the dinners that her father had fixed out on the barbecue grill, bringing in the sizzling meat and carving it quickly before putting it on her child's plate and saying, "Elk." But it was the same animal. Now the herd was drifting out of the giant pines and into a stand of aspen, the gold leaves underfoot the color of their hides, and the stark white trunks of the aspen grove making it look as if the herd was trapped behind bars. Though still they kept drifting, flowing in and out of and between those bars. And when Jill saw the biggest one, the giant among them, she picked him, not knowing any better, unaware that the meat would be tougher than that of a younger animal. Raising on one knee, she found, with the crosshairs of the scope, the cleft formed just behind his right shoulder as he quartered away from her. She did not allow herself to be distracted by the magnificent crown of antlers atop his head. And when he stopped, in his last moment, and swung his head to face her, having sensed her presence, she squeezed the trigger as she'd been taught to do back when she was a girl. The giant elk leapt, hump-shouldered, like a bull in a rodeo, then took a few running steps before stumbling, as if the bullet had not shredded his heart and half his lungs, but had instead merely confused him. He crashed heavily to the ground, as if attached to an invisible tether, got up, ran once more, and fell again. The herd stared at him, trying to discern his meaning, and disoriented too by the sudden explosive sound. Jill rose to her feet and was watching the great bull's thrashings, wondering whether to shoot again, and still the rest of the herd stared at her with what she could recognize only as disbelief. The bull got up and ran again. This time he did not fall, having figured out in his grounded thrashings how to accommodate his strange new dysfunction so as to not impede his desire, which was to escape. And with one leg and shoulder tucked high against his chest, like a man carrying a satchel, and his hind legs spread wider for stability, he galloped off, running now like a horse in hobbles, and with his immense mahogany-colored rack tipped back for balance. What was once his pride and power was now a liability. The rest of the herd turned and followed him into the timber, disappearing into the forest embrace. And for a long while she could hear the crashing of limbs and branches. And then the sounds grew fainter and farther, and then there was only silence. Not knowing any better back then, she set out after the herd rather than waiting to let the bull settle down and lie down and bleed to death. She didn't know that if pushed, a bull could run for miles with his heart in tatters, running as if on magic or spirit, rather than the conventional pump house mechanics of ventricles and aortas. That if pushed, a bull could run for months with his lungs exploded or full of blood. As if, in his dying, the bull was able to metamorphose into some entirely other creature, taking its air, its oxygen, straight into its blood, through its gaping, flopping mouth, as a fish does. And as if it was able to still disseminate its blood, pressing and pulsing it to the farthest reaches of its body and back again without the use of a heart, relying instead on some kind of mysterious current and desire, the will to cohere, far larger than its own, the blood sloshing back and forth, willing the elk forward, willing the elk to keep being an elk. Jill had had it in her mind to go to the spot where the elk had first fallen. Even from where she was, 50 or 60 yards distant, she could see the patch of torn up earth, and to find and follow the trail of blood from that point. She was already thinking ahead and looking beyond that first spot when she walked into the barbed wire fence that separated the national forest from the adjoining private property, on which the big herd had been sequestered. The fence was strung so tight that she bounced backwards, falling much as the elk had fallen, and in her inexperience she'd been holding the trigger on her rifle, and with a shell chambered in case she should see the big bull again. And as she fell, she gripped the trigger, discharging the rifle a second time, with a sound even more cavernous in its unexpectedness than the first shot. A branch high above her intercepted the bullet, and the limb came floating slowly down, drifting like a kite. From her back, she watched it land quietly, and she continued to lie there, bleeding a little and trembling, before finally rising and climbing over the fence with its posted signs, and continuing on after the elk. She was surprised by how hard it was to follow his blood trail. Only a damp splatter here and there, sometimes red and other times drying brown already against the yellow aspen leaves that looked like spilled coins, as if some thief had been wounded while ferrying away a strong box and had spilled his blood upon that treasure. It was amazing to her how little blood there was, a drop here, a drop there. She couldn't stop marveling at how few clues there were. It was easier to follow the tracks in the soft earth and the swath of broken branches than it was the blood trail. She came to the edge of the timber and looked out across a small plowed field, the earth dark from having just been turned over to stubble. Her elk was collapsed dead out in the middle of it. The rest of the herd was long gone, nowhere to be seen. And there was a truck parked next to the elk already, and standing next to the elk were two older men in cowboy hats. Jill was surprised then at how tall the antlers were, taller than either man, even with the elk lying stretched out on the bare ground. The men did not appear happy to see her coming. It seemed to take her a long time to reach them. It was hard walking over the furrows and clods of stubble, and from the looks on the men's faces, she was afraid that the elk might have been one of their pets, that they might even have given it a name. It wasn't that bad as it turned out, but it still wasn't good. Their features softened a little as she closed the final distance and they saw how young she was and how frightened. She could have been either man's daughter. And as she approached, there seemed to be some force of energy about her that disposed them to think the best of her. They found it hard to believe, too, that she had knowingly killed the elk illegally, that had she knowingly killed the elk illegally, she would be marching right up to claim it. There were no handshakes, no introductions. There was still frost on the windshield of the men's truck, and Jill realized they must have jumped into their truck and cold started it, racing straight up to where they knew the herd hung out, used to hang out. Plumes of fog breath leapt from the first man's mouth as he spoke, even though they were all standing in the sunlight. You shot it over on the other side of the fence, right? Over on the National Forest. And it leapt the fence and came over here to die? He asked, and he was not being sarcastic. As if, now that he could see Jill's features and her fear and youth, he could not bear to think of her as a poacher. The other man, who appeared to be a few years the elder, they looked like brothers, with the older one somewhere in his 60s and fiercer looking, interrupted before she could answer and said, Those elk knew never to cross that fence during hunting season. That bull wouldn't let them. I've been watching him for 5 years, and any time a cow or calf even looks at that fence, he tipped his antlers at them and hurries them away from it. Jill saw that such an outburst was as close to a declaration of love for the animal as the old man would be capable of uttering. And the three of them looked down at the massive animal, whose body heat they could still feel radiating from it, the elk's eyes closed, and still only what seemed like a little blood dribbling down the left shoulder from the exit wound. The post-rut musk odor of the bull was intense, and all Jill could say was, I'm sorry. The younger brother seemed almost alarmed by this admission. You didn't shoot him on our side, did you? He asked again. For whatever reason, he was over on the public land, and you shot him, and he ran back over here, right? Jill looked down at her feet and then again at the bull. She might as well have shot an elephant, she thought. She felt trembly and nauseated. She glanced at her rifle to be sure the chamber was open. No, she said quietly. Oh, Christ, the younger man said. The older one just glared at her, hawkish, but also slightly surprised now. And again, the younger one said, Are you sure? Maybe you didn't see it leap the fence? Jill showed him the scratch marks on her arms and on her face. I didn't know the fence was there, she said. The sun was coming up, and I didn't see it. Both men stared at her as if she were some kind of foreigner, or as if she were making some fabulous claim and challenging them to believe it. What was the second shot? The older man asked, looking back toward the woods. Why did it come so much later? As if suspecting that she might have a second animal down somewhere back in the forest. As if this frail girl, this child, might have a vendetta against the entire herd. The gun went off by accident when I walked into the fence, she said, and both men frowned in a way that told her that gun carelessness was even worse in their book than elk poaching. Is it unloaded now? The younger brother asked, almost gently. No, she said, I don't guess it is. Why don't you unload it now? He asked. And she complied, bolting and unbolting the magazine 3 times with a gold cartridge cartwheeling to the black dirt each time. The older brother crouched and picked up the 3 cartridges and handed them to her. Well, shit fire, he said, after she put them in her pocket and stood waiting for him to speak. Would she go to jail? Would she be arrested or fined? That's a big animal. I don't suppose you have much experience cleaning them, do you? She shook her head. The brothers looked back down the hill, in the direction of their farmhouse, Jill supposed. The fire unstoked, the breakfast unmade, autumn chores still undone, with snow coming any day, and a whole year's worth of battening down, or so it seemed to do in that narrow wedge of time. Well, let's do it right, the elder said. Come with us back down to the house, and we'll get some warm water and towels, a saw and axe, and a come-along. He squinted at her, more curious than unkind. What did you intend to do after shooting this animal? He asked. Jill patted her hip. I've got a pocket knife, she said. Both brothers looked at each other and then broke into incredulous laughter, with tears coming to the eyes of the younger one. Might I see it? The younger one asked when he could catch his breath. But the querulous civility of his question sent his brother off to laughing again. They both broke into guffaws. And when Jill showed them her little folding pocket knife, it was too much for them, and they nearly dissolved. The younger brother had to lean against the truck and daub at his rheumy eyes with a bandana, and the morning was still so cold that some of the tears were freezing in his eyelashes, which had the effect, in that morning sunlight, of making him look delicate. Both men wore gloves, and they each took the right one off to shake hands with her and to introduce himself. Bruce, the younger, Ralph, the elder. Well, congratulations, Ralph said grudgingly. He is a big damn animal. You're first, I reckon, said Bruce as he shook her hand. She was surprised by the softness of it, almost a tenderness. Ralph's had been more arthritic and knotted with muscle. And he smiled. "You won't ever shoot one bigger than this," he said. They rode down to their cabin in the truck, Jill sitting between them. It seemed odd to her to just go off and leave the animal lying there in the field. And on the way there, they inquired tactfully about her life, whether she had a brother who hunted, or a father, or even a boyfriend. They asked if her mother was a hunter, and it was her turn to laugh. "My father used to hunt," she said, and they softened a bit further. They made a big breakfast for her. Bacon cut from hogs they had raised and slaughtered, and fried eggs from chickens they likewise kept, and cathead biscuits. After a couple of cups of black coffee, they gathered the equipment required for disassembling the elk and drove back up on the hill. The frost was burning off the grass, and the day was warming so that they were able to work without their jackets. Jill was struck by how different the brothers seemed once they settled into their work. Not quite aggressive, but forceful with their efficiency. In a way, it seemed to her that the elk was coming back to life and expanding, even in its diminishment, the two old men leaning into it like longshoremen, with Jill helping them, laboring to roll the beast over on its back and inverting the great head with the long daggered antlers, which now, upended, sank into the freshly furrowed earth like some mythic harrow fashioned by gods. And once they had the elk overturned, Ralph emasculated it with his skinning knife, cutting off the ponderous genitals quickly and tossing them farther into the field with no self-consciousness. It was merely the work that needed doing. And with that same large knife, the handle of which was made of elk antler, he ran the blade up beneath the taut skin from crotch to breastbone, while Bruce kept the four legs splayed wide to give Ralph room to work. They peeled the hide back to the ribs as if opening the elk for an operation or a resuscitation. How can I ever eat all of this animal, Jill wondered. And again, like a surgeon, Bruce placed spreader bars between the elk's hocks, bracing wide the front legs as well as the back. Ralph slit open the thick gray skin drum of fascia that held beneath it the stomach and intestines, heart and lungs and spleen and liver, kidneys and bladder. And then, looking like nothing so much as a grizzly grubbing beneath boulders on a hillside or burrowing, Ralph reached up into the enormous cavity and wrapped both arms around the stomach mass, partially disappearing into the carcass, as if somehow being consumed by it rather than the other way around. And with great effort, he was able finally to tug the stomach and all the other internal parts free. As they pulled loose, they made a tearing, ripping, sucking sound, and once it was all out, Ralph and Bruce rolled and cut out with that same sharp knife the oversized heart as big as a football and the liver and laid them out on the tailgate of their truck. Then Ralph rolled the rest of the guts, twice as large as any medicine ball, away from the carcass, pushing it as if shoving some boulder away from a cave's entrance. Jill was surprised by the sudden focusing of color in her mind and in the scene. Surely all the colors had been present all along, but for her it was suddenly as if some gears had clicked or aligned, allowing some subtle rearrangement or recombination to blossom now into her mind's palette. The gold of the wheat stubble and the elk's hide, the dark chocolate of the antlers, the dripping crimson blood midway up both of Ralph's arms, the blue sky, the yellow aspen leaves, the black earth of the field, the purple liver, the maroon heart, Bruce's black and red plaid work shirt, Ralph's faded old denim. The richness of those colors was illuminated so starkly in that October sunlight that it seemed to stir chemicals of deep pleasure in Jill's own blood, elevating her to a happiness and a fullness that she had not known earlier in the day. And she smiled at Bruce and Ralph and understood in that moment that she too was a hunter, might always have been. They tilted the elk up, and blood roared from the elk's open carcass, gushing out from between its huge legs, a brilliant fountain in that soft light. The blood splashed and splattered as it hit the new-turned earth. Ralph and Bruce stood by watching the elk drain as if nothing phenomenal at all were happening, as if they'd seen it thousands of times before. And the porous black earth drank thirstily this outpouring, this torrent. Bruce looked over at Jill and said, "Basically it's easy. You just carve away everything you don't want to eat." Jill couldn't take her eyes off how fast the soil was drinking in the blood. Against the dark earth, the stain of it was barely even noticeable. When the blood had finally stopped draining, Ralph filled a plastic wash basin with warm, soapy water from a jug and scrubbed his hands carefully, leisurely, precisely, pausing even to clean the soap from beneath his fingernails with a smaller pocket knife. And when he was done, Bruce poured a gallon jug of clean water over Ralph's hands and wrist to rinse the soap away. And then Ralph dried his hands and arms with a clean towel and emptied out the old bloody wash water, then filled it anew, and it was time for Bruce to do the same. Jill marveled at this privileged glimpse at a life or two lives beyond her own, a life, two lives of cautious competence fitted to the world. And she was grateful to the elk and its gone-away life beyond the sheer bounty of the meat it was providing her, grateful to it for having led her into this place, the small and obscure, if not hidden window of these two men's lives. She watched as each man worked with his own knife to peel back the hide, working on each side of the elk simultaneously. Then, with the hide eventually off, they handed it to Jill and told her it would make a wonderful shirt or robe. She was astonished at the weight of it. Next, they began sawing the forelegs and stout shins of the hind legs. And only now, with those removed, did the creature begin to look reduced or compromised. They swung the huge shoulders aside like the wings of an immense flying dinosaur, and then pulled them free, each man wrapping both arms around the slab of shoulder to hold it above the ground. They stacked the shoulders in the truck next to the rolled-up fur of the hide. Next, the hindquarters, one at a time, severed with a bone saw, both men working together to heft that weight into the truck, and the remaining length of bone and antler and gleaming socket and rib cage looking reptilian, like some reverse evolutionary process. She thought how she would have liked to watch her father render an elk. All gone into the past now, however, like blood draining back into the soil. How much else had she missed? They let Jill work with a skinning knife, showed her how to separate the muscles lengthwise with her fingers before cutting them free of the skeleton. The backstrap unscrolling beneath the urging of her knife, the meat as dense as stone, it seemed, yet as fluid as a river, and so beautiful in that sunlight, maroon to nearly purple, nearly iridescent in its richness and in the absence of any intramuscular fat. From time to time, their lower backs would cramp from working so intently, and they would have to lie down on the ground, all three of them, looking up at the sky and spreading their arms out wide as if on a crucifix, and would listen to and feel with pleasure the subtle popping and realigning of their vertebrae, and would stare up at that blue sky and listen to the cries of the feeding birds, and feel intensely their richness at possessing now so much meat, clean meat, and at simply being alive, with the blood from their labor drying quickly to a light crust on their hands and arms. They were like children in those moments, and they might easily have napped. They finished late that afternoon and sawed the antlers off for Jill to take home with her. Being old school, the brothers dragged what was left of the carcass back into the woods, returning it to the forest, returning the skeleton to the very place where the elk had been bedded down when Jill had first crept up on it, as if she had only borrowed it from the forest for a while. And then they drove back down to their ranch house and hung the ham and shoulder quarters on meat hooks to age in the barn, and draped the back straps likewise from hooks, where they would leave them for at least a week. They ran the loose scraps, nearly 100 pounds worth, through a hand-cranked grinder, and while Ralph and Jill processed and wrapped that in 2-pound packages, Bruce cooked some of the butt steak in an iron skillet, seasoned with garlic and onions and butter and salt and pepper, mixed with a few of the previous spring's dried morels, reconstituted. And he brought out small plates of that meal, thinly sliced, to eat as they continued working, the three of them grinding and wrapping, and the mountain of meat growing on the table beside them. They each had a tumbler of whiskey to sip as they worked, and when they finally finished, it was nearly midnight. The brothers offered their couch to Jill, and she accepted. They let her shower first, and they built a fire for her in the wood stove next to the couch. Afterward, they sat up visiting, each with another small glass of whiskey. Ralph and Bruce telling her their ancient histories until none of them could stay awake. Their eyes kept closing and their heads kept drooping. And with the fire burning down, Ralph and Bruce roused from their chairs and made their ways each to his bedroom, and Jill pulled the old elk hides over her for warmth and fell deeply and immediately asleep, falling as if through some layering of time, and with her hunting season already over that year. That elk would not be coming back, and her father would not be coming back. She was the only one remaining with those things safe and secure in her now, for a while. She killed more elk and deer too in seasons after that, learning more about them year by year in the killing than she could ever learn otherwise. Ralph died of a heart attack several years later and was buried in the yard outside the ranch house, and Bruce died of pneumonia the next year, overwhelmed by the rigors of twice the amount of work. And he too was buried in the yard next to Ralph in an aspen grove, through which passed on some nights wandering herds of deer and elk, the elk direct descendants of the big bull Jill had shot, and which the brothers had dismembered and then shared with her, the three of them eating on it for well over a year. The elk sometimes pausing to gnaw at the back of those aspen with roots that reached now for the chest of the buried old men. Remembering these things, a grown woman now woven of losses and gains, Jill sometimes looks down at her body and considers the mix of things, the elk becoming her as she ate it, and becoming Ralph and Bruce as they ate it. Did this make them somehow distantly like brothers and sister, or uncles and niece, if not fathers and daughter? And the two old men becoming the soil then in their burial, as had her father. Her own gone-away father, worm food, elk food now, but how he had loved it. And her memories of the same country he had loved. She likes to think now that each day as she moves farther away from him, she is also moving closer to him. As if within her, beneath the span of her own days, there are other hunts going on continuously, giant elk in flight from the pursuit of hunters other than herself, and the birth of other mountains being plotted and planned, other mountains rising, and more mountains vanishing into distant seas, and that even more improbable than her encountering that one giant elk on her first hunt was the path, the wandering line that brought her to her father in that first place, that delivered her to him and had made him hers and she his. The improbability and yet the certainty that would place the two of them in each other's lives, tiny against the backdrop of the world and tinier still against the mountains of time, but belonging to each other, as much in death as in life, inescapably and forever. The hunt showing her that.
Good evening. First, always comes the river. When an interviewer recently asked Kim Barnes if she writes during summer spent in the wilderness, she replied, "No, I fish. Thank God." She fishes and thinks and lets the quietude of wild places take precedence. Thankfully, too, Kim Barnes spends her in-town months as a writer and teacher of writing. And that wilderness is never far from her. Late morning, she writes, "The rain is nearly done, already a remembered thing. Swallows rest in their cool fists of mud. Trout do not rise, but hold in the submerged roots of cottonwood. Rattlesnakes thick with summer wool find fissures in stone, stretch themselves thin." Kim was born and raised in Idaho's Clearwater River country, the daughter of a logger father and housewife mother who came west from Oklahoma to escape lives of poverty, alcoholism, and tragedy. She has rarely ventured far from the Clearwater. Her memoirs and novels tell its stories. The story of the Clearwater is, in fact, the story of the West, she recently told High Country News. It's a story of the westward movement toward hope and plenty, a story that seldom proved true, she said. It's a story of how class has defined the majority of the West's inhabitants. That sense of everything being maybe. Maybe the rains will come. Maybe the forests won't burn. Maybe we'll get our elk this year. Maybe my father's back will heal. Maybe my mother will sell enough pies to buy herself a new coat for the winter. One of my family's favorite sayings, she said, is Lord willing and the creek don't rise. But of course, the creek at some point always rises. Kim Barnes teaches creative writing at the University of Idaho and lives with her husband on Moscow Mountain. Her first memoir, In the Wilderness, Coming of Age in Unknown Country, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 1997. She's also author of Hungry for the World, a memoir, and 2 novels, Finding Caruso and the just published A Country Called Home, the story of a young physician and his rebellious moneyed wife who come to Idaho in search of redemption in a simpler wilderness life, but who find, of course, that there is much anguish and complexity amidst the beauty, and that the creek ultimately always rises. Please join me in welcoming Kim Barnes. Thank you.
First, the river. Mountain wash of snow melt through granite, past fir, larch, red cedar, and pine. The canyon where the water widens, runs deeper, eddies in against rimrock, gullets the bank's soft palate. And then the car, sunbit to ruddy red, following the highway that parallels the river, matching it curve for curve. Late morning, the rain is nearly done, already a remembered thing. Swallows rest in their cool fists of mud. Trout do not rise but hold in the submerged roots of cottonwood. Rattlesnakes thick with summer vole find fissures in stone, stretch themselves thin. The farmers have taken to their houses to nap, or they sit at the tables of their wives, drinking iced tea, creamed coffee, thinking their silence nothing more than what is wise, their women wind-scalded, planning cold cuts for dinner. Stock lean into shadow, ear flick of fly, twitch of hide and tell, all nearly motionless, except the river and the car beside it, one channeling west toward the ocean, the other marking east. The driver is young, clean of face, frankly beautiful. Her mouth is simple, contained, her eyes noticeably gray. Chestnut hair, layers of lighter gold and darker brown, long links of it rising and falling in the wind coming in through the windows. The steering wheel is loose in her hands, fingers gently curled, wrists relaxed. When she guides the car left, she leans her head left. When the road swings right, she moves with it, as though to a slow music. A simple cotton skirt, a quiet floral print, hem height to mid-thigh. Her ankles are swollen, the heat. The air wings in, the feel of it at the hollow of her throat, lifting the fine hairs at her neck, along her legs, mineral and silt, musky alder. The old dog rises to a sit, rests its muzzle on her arm, eyes clouded white, the silver of its rough, faded gray. There are no cars ahead, none behind. Still, she remembers to signal left at the one-lane bridge condemned by the county, seldom used except by the locals, who, as they always have, weigh risk against utility. Wooden planks clack and rattle beneath her, right at the crossroad, then up and over Angel Ridge. Miles of river below her now, edged by fields of mown wheat, floodplains of stubbled alfalfa. She stops at the first side road leading back down the canyon face, considers, drives on. The skin of her legs is blushed with sun, sweat beneath her breasts, in the bends of her arms. She spreads her knees, brings them together again, fills the moisture there. The second dirt road she forgoes, and then the third. At the fourth, she shifts into low, descends into the shelter of locust. A few months earlier, the grove would have been heady with sugar blossom, a vast black drone of foraging bees. She feels a small regret. Perhaps she should have come sooner. Still, there is the comfort, the respite from sharp light. The road narrows to a rutted path. The car's undercarriage catches dirt, then granite. She holds the wheel harder, hears the scree of metal against stone, the clatter of something torn loose. The dog tries to stand, to balance itself, but falls forward against the dash. The canopy grows dense with sumac, cottonwood, vine maple, the air through the window damp, like the inside of a cave, walls seeping. Birds flit and trill from their cover, a grouse beats up, quails sally from behind a mossy stump, take wing, disappear into a tinkle of wild rose. Somewhere just ahead is the railroad track running its spine of land, and then the river. Before her, an ancient bramble of blackberry, the small bitter fruit still pale, no sun to ripen. She noses forward against the shriek of canes raking the doors. The car groans and she pushes harder until the tires spin, the smell of sap and berry pulp mixing with the sweat of rubber. She presses in until the canes have bent and broken, let down their wounded limbs behind her, pushed up over the top. When the engine dies, she clicks off the key, imagines she hears the river, its constant thrum like the sound of sleep. She slides back the seat to give herself more room. It is easier to breathe, the jab of the steering wheel gone from her belly. She'll have to walk to the river now. There is no other way. She pulls the handle, pushes the door open, but the vines hold tight. An inch of space, no more. She resists the urge to roll the glass shut against the bramble. She has seen how quickly the canes snake and grow, like the kudzu her father once spoke of, how it wreathed the telephone poles, covered entire houses in a matter of days, alive with intent. She leans across the seat, thumbs open the glove box, and finds her father's straight razor, mother of pearl, blade newly honed. It is the tool she has known all her life, 17 years, memories of early mornings. She thinks she might cut her way out, but the blade only bleeds the vines. There is a flutter of movement in the cradle of her hips, a tightness low in her groin, like a fist squeezing from the inside, then letting go. An exhaustion so complete that she must let her head loll back against the seat. I need to rest, she thinks, and then I'll go to the river. The dog pants, whines, sniffs the breeze through the open window. She closes her eyes, hears the sawbugs cutting the air, the whisper of branches, the ravens overhead. She is held in that pleasant lull between waking and dreams. She hears her father talking in the gray tones of a serious man, his voice growing faint as she drifts closer to sleep. He is bidding her back, insisting that she stay in this place he has made for her, this paradise. She's cold. She wishes for her father's arms to lift her, to carry her to the house with its smells of cold bacon and laundry, to lay her in her bed, cup her head like a blessing, like the moment of her birth, when he pulled her from her mother, that river of water and blood, and guided her into another world. I've just read the prologue of my novel, A Country Called Home, set along the Clearwater River of Idaho. That scene takes place in 1977. I read these pages for the first time several years ago at the Montana Festival of the Book, when this novel was just beginning to shape in my head. It's one of the many things I treasure about this gathering in Missoula, a place where you can trot out your green ponies and see how they ride. I want to thank Sherry for such a generous introduction, Humanities Montana, Kim Anderson, Judy, Ken, Claire, and everyone who brings this festival together. It is always an honor to be here and in such extraordinary company. Like so many of you, I miss Jim Crumley's presence in the world. More than a decade ago, when my first book was out, I'd flown from Idaho to Miami for the International Book Fair. It was nearly midnight when I finally arrived at the hotel. I'd never been so far from home. I was bone tired from 15 hours of airplanes and airports, sick with too many mini bottles of bad wine, and truly anxious about my reading the next day. I was dragging my suitcase down the hallway when I heard a rough voice calling from the smoky darkness of the hotel lounge. "Barnes! Hey, Barnes!" I peered into the dim light, and there sat Jim, surrounded by a raucous group of new friends and old fans. He motioned me in, said, "You look like hell," put his arm around my shoulder, and bought me a drink. It was less the whiskey than Jim's presence that made me believe that there was nothing to fear. Not in Miami, not in this world. Jim had faced down enough demons for all of us. In this book, my main characters are Thomas and Helen Derricott, a young physician and his wife who have left New Haven for rural Idaho, as Sherry has mentioned, part of the Back to the Land movement of the 1960s. Even though neither knows the first thing about building a fire or hammering a nail, they buy an abandoned homestead in the Clearwater Canyon outside the village of Fife. Manny is a young man they pay room and board to help them. After the death of his mother as a child and the disappearance of his father, the women of Fife went about a kind of communal adoption and passed Manny from one family to the other until he was old enough to strike out on his own. I'm going to read a section from part 2 of the book, which tells the story of Thomas and Helen's daughter, Elise. It takes place in 1977, a few months before the prologue that I read. You'll hear reference to a great February flood. Some of you may remember it, 1996 in reality. And to an Australian shepherd named simply Dog. Elise is a 17-year-old who has lost her mother and has been raised in relative isolation by her father and by Manny. You need to know that Elise has a condition known as synesthesia, the crossing of senses in which her vision is literally flooded with color when she hears music. Nabokov, by the way, was a synesthete, as was Duke Ellington and Kandinsky. In her quest for community and belonging, Elise has joined a small, severely fundamentalist church in Fife, and the preacher has convinced her that because of her synesthesia, she is demon-possessed. In order to rid herself of the demon, she begins a severe regimen of fasting and prayer, which brings about a violent confrontation with her father, who throws her Bible into the fire of the wood stove. This is a story of how we must face the demons of our own making, a story of our ongoing quest to find our people, that place we might call home. As Bill Kittredge has noted, we need stories in which our home is sacred, stories about making use of the place where we live without ruining it, stories that tell us to stay humane amid our confusions. Bill's stories inform my life every single day, and if Bill is here, I can almost hear what he is thinking right now. I wish to God she'd just shut up and read. And so I will. A quote from Frederick Bourdin: "When you fight monsters, be careful that in the process you do not become one." It was Elise's voice that brought Manny running from his pickup, not a call for help, but a near scream. "Daddy!" 3 times she cried it as though she were calling her father back from the dead, but Jesus God, he had not expected to see Darricot dragging the girl across the yard as she twisted to get away, her skirt muddied and torn. Manny didn't know that the words had left his mouth until Darricot stopped and turned his way, and so he said it again. "Let her go, Thomas." And Darricot did. He let the girl go. Manny relaxed the clutch of his fists. He hadn't thought beyond the words, but he knew now that he'd been ready to strike, to take Darricot to the ground. Elise ran weeping toward the barn, and he wanted to follow her to make sure she was all right. But Darricot had turned to face him, his eyes a jolt of gray-white, and Manny knew that this must be settled somehow between them. The dog stayed at his heel, tense, ready. Manny feared that even wrecked with age, she would attack Darricot, close the distance between them before he could stop her. Darricot held up both clenched hands, pounded them once against his thighs, then opened his fingers across his knees and began sinking, as though his shoulders were a yoke cast in iron, his spine soft lead. Manny lunged to catch him, and both of them went down, Darricot making little noises like an animal dying or in the throes of birth. Dog, sensing mercy, licked their hands. Darricot was crying, though it sounded more like a series of coughs, each sob like a jab to the breastbone, expelling puffs of air. Manny smelled the sourness of Darricot's clothes, the clabbered breath, the hair grown long at the collar, but what could he say? Such observation might shame them both, drive them more firmly into the silence that had settled between them. "Here." He nudged Darricot upright. "Let's get in the house, get warm." He stood and pulled Darricot up after him. He tried not to be too tender, though Darricot was rain-wet and trembling. They trundled across the yard and through the door. Manny led Darricot to a kitchen chair, took his jacket, and hung it along with his own on pegs behind the stove. He filled the coffee pot and put out a plate of fig bars. He was sure Elise had gone to his apartment above the barn. He would let things settle, give her some time. He brought the coffee and whiskey and sat at the table with Darricot. They'd made a mess of the floor, weeks since the flood, and he was still dozing the mud, moving it from one ditch to another, from mound to mound, like shoveling sand. He pushed the cookies closer to Darricot before taking one to himself. He wondered if Darricot was clear-headed enough for the whiskey to help. Darricot wiped back several thin strands of hair, his hand shaking. "I'm not fit for this," he said. "Not for any of it." Manny took his time chewing, poured a little whiskey to cool his coffee, which he needed sooner rather than later. Darricot pulled a cigarette from its pack and rested both arms on the table. "I came in, she was lying face down on the floor, arms out like she was dead." He drank his coffee in a single draught and poured straight whiskey. "Those people, they've told her that the devil is in her eyes. Derek Hott leaned back in his chair. She believes them. There's been a lot that she's believed, Manny said. She'll get over it. Another pour of whiskey. Derek Hott's mouth worked around the liquid as though he were eating glass. Manny would talk to Elise, make her laugh just as he had when she was little, shooing the monsters from beneath her bed, bringing another nightlight, convincing her that she was safe. Maybe the best thing is to let it ride for a while, wait and see how things go. Manny picked up the mugs and moved to the sink. The scant shot would make him more sleepy than relaxed, and he wished he hadn't drunk it. He needed to get through the day's work. He hoped his boots had dried some. I've already told her, Derek Hott said, she's not to leave this house. He rose, reached for his jacket, and slammed out the door. Manny wasn't sure where Derek Hott was headed, maybe to the river, maybe to town. Right now, he didn't care. He rinsed the mugs and placed them in the drainer, then pulled on his boots and coat and stepped outside, Dog limping beside him. He noted the slough of mud, rock, and debris that still burned the barn's north side. The rush of rain and snow melt down the draw had nearly wiped the barn off its piers. He climbed the narrow stairs and knocked lightly before opening his own door. Elise was lying on the couch, covered with what had once been her mare's saddle blanket. He had washed it, offered it to her as remembrance, but she had shaken her head. Since that time, it had draped the back of his worn sofa, gone from utility to decor. Dog wanted to nuzzle and lick Elise, but Manny pointed to the floor and she sat, the stub of her tail beating a phantom rhythm. Manny thought that the dog loved Elise almost as much as him, and he was glad. The girl was something of an orphan, and he understood how the church might feel that need for family, all those brothers and sisters caring so dearly for your soul. Manny folded a piece of bread around a swath of peanut butter and heated milk for hot chocolate, then sat down across from her, noting the quick rise and fall of her breathing. Here's some cocoa, sandwich, get you through until dinner. I'm not hungry, she said, her voice muffled, childlike. Manny set the plate and mug on the old bench that served as a resting place for his books and for his heels when he was reading. Here it is anyway, eat what you want. He waited. He needed to get the tractor unrigged and put away, animals fed, but he couldn't imagine leaving her sad and alone beneath the old wool blanket, its stripes shrunken and bleeding into one another because he had failed to remember what some mother most surely had taught him: never wash wool in hot water. He thought of the scratchy remnant of his father's horse blanket that he had carried from house to house, how each good woman in succession had attempted to wrest it from his hands, sure it harbored fleas, how he bawled and fought until they'd given up but kept their eye on it as though it were a snappish cur. He couldn't recall when he'd last had it in his possession and wondered how he could have held on to something so fiercely and not remember letting it go. The dog lay down, drowsy with warmth. Manny thought he'd let his boots dry for a few minutes, then get to it. He sat in the chair closest to the window and dozed. When he heard Elise stir, he watched through half-closed eyes as she fed Dog the sandwich, then set the mug on the floor to be lapped clean. He could have questioned her actions, but didn't, because he was seeing something he hadn't noted before. The pallor of her skin, the joints of her elbows swollen against the thinness of her arms. Beneath the sweaters, the tangled skirt, she was nothing but a clatter of bones. It had happened so fast. How could he have missed such a dwindling? When she rose and took the empty plate and cup to the sink, Manny pretended a yawn. That tasted good, Elise said. Thanks. Manny smiled because he didn't know what else to do. I don't think I'll be hungry for dinner. Maybe I'll just go to bed. She looked out the window, the moon rising over Angel Ridge. Do you think we'll ever find her? Manny wondered what answer he should give other than the one that was true. No, he said, we'll never find her. He waited until her steps had left the stairway, then watched from the window as she walked to the house, her skirts catching the wind coming up off the river. He pulled the blanket to his lap and wondered at the disappearance of that other Elise he had taken to the fair only months before, sassy in her showy clothes, smoking with the bravado of a barmaid. He felt a sudden and knowing sadness that somehow he had failed. Like Derrickott, he wasn't fit for any of it. He would put the tractor away, feed the animals. He'd clean the mud from the kitchen, and while he was doing these things, he would plan dinner, something Elise would smell and be unable to resist. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes and gravy, carrots cooked in butter and brown sugar. He wished the mare were still with them. He wished for his father's giant horses that had carried him so carefully across the land. He wished for Helen, for things to be like they were before. "Come," he said to Dog, "we got work to do." They went out into the almost dark, stopping long enough to note the car lights following the river's curve. In a few more hours, the temperature would drop and the roads become sheer with ice. He wished he could warn those distant travelers, tell them of the dangers ahead. He fired up the tractor and steered toward the barn. Already he could hear the old cow mawing for feed. The hens were down to 4, the rest gone to raccoons and an overly lustful rooster who killed with his splendid ardor, then was himself carried off in the soft muzzle of a fox. The goat pens were empty, the horse stall given over to spiders and pack rats. It was a diminishment he believed he could live with, a reduction that intensified the care of what was left, although there were times when lying in bed, he felt the immense emptiness of the barn below him. By the time Thomas returned home, Manny would have the food on the table, maybe a pecan pie, maybe a shot of whiskey after dinner, when it was right. He might put on some quiet music that would have pleased Helen and would prove to Elise that the devil was not in her. Maybe he'd go to the church himself. Maybe they would shift their gaze toward him, divine all the demons he harbored. The cow grunted as he pitched the hay and threw the chickens to scratch. "Come, Dog," he said, and headed toward the house, where light illuminated the kitchen. Through the window, he could see Elise at the table, her head bowed. He saw her stand, raise her arms, and begin to sway. He thought he could hear the sing-song repetition of her praise. She looked like a crazy woman, her hair matted, her skirt torn. She brought the tips of her fingers to her eyes, then raised her hands. 2 times she did this, as though her eyes were twin mouths, her fingers ferrying kisses to heaven. And as she brought her fingers down for the 3rd time, he saw the look on her face change, no longer peaceful in prayer, but angry, like the face of an enraged child. She shook her head, cupped her ears as though trying to keep the sound of the world at bay, and then she brought her fingers to her face and began clawing as though she meant to blind herself. Manny ran to the door and reached the table as a chair skittered from beneath her. He grabbed her wrists, pulled her hands away, Dog barking wildly beside him. Elise was screaming, thrashing. Manny straddled her thin body and pinned her to the floor. She was wrenching her head back and forth, and all he could see were the scratches along her cheeks, the dark spatter of her lashes. He held her there until she had exhausted herself. She was crying, and the thought of the salt in the wounds made him groan. He rolled her into his lap, felt how small she'd become, and clasped her wet face to his chest. He heard Derrickott's car turning in and saw the headlights cutting the window. "Hurry," he whispered, swaddling the girl in her rags, rocking, rocking, humming a lullaby that came from some heart once held close to his own. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Ellen Crane. I'm the chair of Humanities Montana. I want to welcome you and thank you for being here this evening. It is my pleasure to introduce this evening Tom McGuane. Tom McGuane may not qualify as a Montanan by the state's traditional standards, which would be residency at least 3 generations back on one's mother's side, but he is a champion cutting horse rider. McGuane has lived in Montana for 40 years and raised a family, and above all, he's trained his rider's eye on this state for nearly that many years. I think literature lovers around the world at this point deem Tom McGuane synonymous with Montana, and we're very proud of that. Tom McGuane was born in Michigan. He attended Michigan State University, where coincidentally he met Jim Harrison. He would become another newcomer to Montana. McGuane went on to earn an MFA at Yale and received a Wallace Stegner Fellowship to Stanford University, another potent that he may end up in the Big Sky country. His first published novel, The Sporting Club, was published in 1969. It was a huge success, and soon thereafter he moved to southwest Montana, where he maintained a presence ever since. In fact, in the bio that Tom provided to us, which was very brief and modest, to say the least, he stated that he, his wife, their 4 children, and 5 grandchildren all lived in southwest Montana, where they raised cattle and horses. And I guess it goes without saying that one of them writes a little. Tom is the author of 9 books of fiction, 2 books of nonfiction, and his latest short story collection entitled Gallatin Canyon is receiving all kinds of attention. The accolades for this book have been extensive. Stephen Metcalf in the New York Times Book Review said, McGuane has become our poet-philosopher of the arm's length, of the prudently aborted intimacy that keeps both isolation and commitment equally at bay. I want you to help me welcome Tom McGuane, a gentleman and a Montanan.
It's nice to be back in Missoula. I remember the first time I ever came here, it was almost 40 years ago. And Jim Harrison and I came in a green car, a little green car that didn't run very well. And it kept quitting all the way between Livingston and Missoula. And we'd get out and kind of run with it. And it would catch and start, and then we'd try to catch it before it got away from us. And Jim couldn't drive a stick shift car, so I devised a plan where he would be the runner and I'd be the driver. We came up here and we met Jim Welsh and Bill Kittredge and Dick Hugo, and we all went to Kittredge's house after stopping for an enormous liquor supply. And we went on into a period of genuine commode-hugging blind staggers that lasted for about 3 days. So I saw Bill today and he said, do you remember the first time you came to Missoula? And I looked him in the eye and I said, no. Another pleasant memory that just came to me. I was signing books in Mississippi a long time ago, and a very shy, very young fellow came up, and I signed a book for him, and he let me know that he too wanted to be a writer. That was Rick Bass. My hat's off to Rick for a splendid career that's got a big, long horizon still. I'm going to just give you a little preface to this not so long story that I'm going to read to you because it does have a kind of an emotional background for me. I was more or less broke in the early 70s, and out of desperation, I wrote a screenplay in about 20 days, which sold and was made into the movie Rancho Deluxe. And I suddenly had a big fat check and no tax problems because I'd never made any money. And I made a down payment on a ranch, and more or less where we've been ever since. But I had no idea what to do with a ranch. I just had one and a mortgage. And I asked an old rancher I knew, I said, look, I'm going to have ranch hands working for me and things like that. They'll quickly see that I don't know what I'm doing. What shall I do? And he said, the first thing to do is to go to bed at 7:30 or 8 at night. And he said, then be out on the ranch at 4 or 4:30. And he said, whoever's working for you will be so guilty for the rest of the day that he won't point out your inadequacies. So for a long time we had different ranch hands working for us and cowboys. And for a long time they were older than me, and now they're younger than me. With the exception of a Irish Sioux mixed blood guy that's been working for me for about 30 years, and he's about 80 now. I'm in my late 60s, and we're both sick of the whole thing, but we can't change. The thing so I got to see cowboys a lot, and there's a great romance about cowboys. I remember Larry McMurtry said that some people like to renovate houses. He was trying to renovate the cowboy. And over time I began to see that since ranching is mostly in the hands of hereditary landowners, and the cowboys will never own land, that it's a sort of a sad, dead-end job. And about 3 years ago, a big ranch in eastern Montana sold and to a Walmart there, and they changed their whole program and let all the cowboys go, most of whom were older fellas. And I was asked to judge the ranch horse sale at the Billings Livestock Yard, where they sell 700 horses a month. And all these cowboys came to town. They brought all of their saddle horses in stock trailers, and many of them came just in these old jalopies. And their horses went through the sale, and they were afoot for presumably the rest of their lives. And at that time, I remember thinking, I would really like to write a cowboy story, which I'd never considered before. That would give me a little bit of a sense of what their lives were like if I could do it. So I did, and it was published in the New Yorker a few years ago, and I'm going to read it to you now. So I'm going to be a bit of a ventriloquist because this is in the voice of the cowboy himself. The old feller made me go into the big house in my stocking feet. The old lady's in a big chair next to the window. In fact, the whole room's full of big chairs, but she's the only one of them, though as big as she is, she could have filled up several. The old man said, pointing to me, I found this one in the loose horse pen at the sale yard. She says, what's he supposed to be? He says, he's supposed to be a cowboy. She said, well then, what's he doing in the loose horses? I said, I was looking for one that would ride. You was in the wrong pen, son, said the old man. Them's canners. They're going to France in cardboard boxes. The old lady says, once they get a steel bolt in the head, she tipped back in her chair and laughed. At that point, I'm sore. I said, there's five in there broke to death. I wrote them with nothing but binder twine. They don't make a shit, said the old man. Every one of them's going to France. The old lady didn't believe me. How'd you get near them loose horses to ride, she said. I went in there at night, I said. The old lady says, you one crazy cowboy go in there in the dark. Them broncs will kick your teeth down your throat. No, she said, I suppose you tried to ride a bareback. He said, no, I drug the saddle I usually ride at the Rose Bowl parade. She said, you got a horse for that? I said, I got Trigger. We unstuffed him. She turns to the old man. She says, he's got a mouth on him, this much we know. Maybe he can tell us what good he is, says the old man. I said, well, I'm a cowboy. She said, well, you're an out-of-work cowboy. And I said, well, it's a dying way of life. She's about like me. She's wondering if this ranch is supposed to be a welfare agency for cowboys, says the old man. I'd had enough. I said, you're the dumb Hanyaker drove out here in the first place. I thought that was the end, but the old lady said, don't get huffy, you got the job. Are you against conversation or something? We get outside and the old sumbitch says, you drawed lucky there, son. That last deal could have pissed her off. I said, it didn't make me know never mind if it did or didn't. Anymore, said the old man, she hadn't been well. Used to she was as sweet as pudding. I said, I'm sorry for that. We don't have our health. We don't have nothing. She must have been afflicted something terrible because she was ugly morning, noon, and night for as long as she lasted. She'd pick a fight over nothing. The old sumbitch bound to got the worst of it, and I felt sorry for him. A little slack as he ever cut me. We had 175 sweet-tempered horned Herefords and 15 sleepy bulls. Shipped the calves all over for hybrid vigor, mostly to the south. Had some go clear to Florida. Hereford still had its horns, was a walking miracle. The old sumbitch had him a smart little deal going. I soon learned to give him credit for such things. The old lady barking commands off the sofa, she weren't no slouch either. Anybody else seen their books might have said they could have been wintering in Phoenix. They didn't have no bunkhouse, just a leisure life mobile home that had lost its wheels about 30 years ago. And they had it positioned by the door of the barn so it'd be convenient for the hired man to stagger out at all hours and fight breech births and scours and any other disorders sent down by the cow gods. And we had some doozies. One heifer got pregnant and her calf was near as big as she was. Had to reach in and take it out in pieces. We threw the head out on the ground, she turned to it and lowed at it like it was her baby. Everything a cow does to make itself into meat just as fast as it can so somebody can eat it. It's a terrible life, and us cowboys are their little helpers. The old sumbitch and I got along pretty good. We got through calving, got to see them pairs and bulls run out onto the new grass. Nothing like seeing all that meat feel a little temporary joy. Then we bladed out the corrals and watched them dry into the spring sun at long last. Only mishap was the manure spreader threw a rock and knocked me senseless, and I drove the rig into the irrigation ditch. The old sumbitch never said a word, just chained up and pulled us out with his Ford. We led his calvie out of the hills afoot with 2 buckets of sweet feed. Had a little of everything, including a blue roan I fancied, but he said it was a Hancock, a buck like the national finals in Las Vegas, kick out behind a squall, and just a man killer. Stick to the bays, he said. The West was one of bay horse. He picked out 3 bays, had a keg of shoes, all ones and aughts, and I shot them best I could. 3 geldings with nice manners, stood good to shoe. About all you could say about the others was they had 4 legs each. A couple, all white marked from saddle galls and years of hard work, looked like maybe no more summers after this. They'd been rode many a long mile. We chased them back in the hills, and the 3 that was shod whinnied and fretted. Back to work, the old sumbitch says to him. We shod 3 because one was going to pack a ton of fencing supplies. Barbed wire, smooth wire, steel T-posts, staples, old wore-out sunflower fence stretchers. Could barely grab on the wire. And we was at it a good little while where the elk had knocked miles of it down or the cedar finally give out and had to be replaced by steel. But that was how I found out the old sumbitch's last good time was in Korea, where the officers would yell, "Come on up here and die." Said they was coming in waves. Tells me all this with this while the stretcher's pulling that wire, squealing through the staples. He was a tough old bastard. He said, they killed a pile of us, we killed a pile of them. Squeak. We hauled We hauled the mineral horseback too in panniers, white salt, iodine salt. He didn't have no use for blocks, so we hauled it in sacks and poured it in the troughs he had on all these bald hilltops where the wind would blow away the flies. Most of his so-called troughs was truck tires nailed onto anything flat, plywood, old doors, such like, but they worked all right. A cow can put her tongue anywhere in a tire and get what she needs, and you can drag one of them flat things with your horse if you need to move them. Most places we salted had old buffalo wallers where them buffalo wallered. They done wallered their last, had to get out of the way for the cow and the man on the bay horse. I'd been rustling my own grub in the leisure life for a good little while when the old lady said it was time for me to eat with the white folks. This wasn't necessarily a good thing. The old lady's knee replacements had begun to fail, and both me and the old sumbitch was about half afraid of her. She cooked good as ever, but she was a bomb waiting to go off. Stood bow-legged at the stove talking ugly about how much she did for us. When she talked, the old sumbitch would move his mouth like he was saying the same words. The old lady caught him at that, they'd have been hell to pay. Both of them was heavy smokers to where an oxygen bottle was in sight. So they joined a smoke enders deal the Lutherans had. This required them to put all their butts in a jar and wear the jar around their neck on a string. The old sumbitch liked this okay because he could just tap his ash under his chin and not get it on the truck seat. But the more that thing filled up and hung around her neck, the meaner the old lady got. She had no idea the old sumbitch was cheating and setting his jar on the woodpile we worked outside. She was just honester than him, and in the end, she gave up smoking, and he smoked away, except he wasn't allowed to in the house no more, nor buy ready-mades, because the new tax made them too expensive, and she wouldn't let him take it out of the cows, which come first. She said it was just a vice, and if he was half the man she thought he was, he'd give it up for a bad deal. You could have a long and happy old age, she told him, real sarcastic-like. One day, me and the old sumbitch was in the house hauling soot out of the fireplace on account of they had a chimney fire last winter. Over the mantel is a picture of a beautiful woman in a red dress with her hair piled on top of her head. The old sumbitch tells me that's the old lady before she joined that motorcycle gang. Oh, I said. He said, them motorcycle gangs, all they do is eat and work on their motorcycles. They taught her to smoke too, but she's shut of that, gonna outlive all of us. Oh, I said, and he says, and if she ever wants to box you, you tell her no, she'll knock you on your ass, I guarantee it. She'll throw you a haymaker, son. I couldn't understand how he could be so casual about the old lady being in a motorcycle gang. When we were smoking in the leisure life, I asked him about it. That's when I found out him and the old lady was brother and sister. I guess that explained it. If your sister joins some motorcycle gang, that's her business. He said she even had a tattoo, Hounds from Hell, with a dog shooting flames out of his nostrils riding a Harley. The picture on the mantel kind of stayed in my mind, and I asked the old sumbitch if his sister ever had a boyfriend. Well, yes, he said, several, quite a damn few. Our folks ran him off, he said. They was only after the land. By now, we was in the barn, and he was going all around the baler, hitting the zerks with his grease gun. He said, I had a lady friend myself, do anything, cook, gangbusters with a snorty horse, and not too damn hard on the eyes. Well, sis run her off, said she was just after the land. If she was, I never could see it. Anyway, she went down the road a long time ago. Fall come around, and when we brought the cabby down, two of them old-timers who'd worked so hard was lame. One was stifled, the other was sweeneyed, both had crippling quarter cracks. I thought they needed to be at the loose horse sale, but the old sumbitch says no amount of mine is gonna feed no Frenchman. And that was that. So we made a hole, led the old timers to the edge, and shot him with an elk rifle. First one didn't know what hit him, second one heard the shot, saw his buddy fall, the old sumbitch had to chase him all around to kill him. Then he sent me down the hole to get the halters back. Lifted them big heads was some chore. I enjoyed eating in the big house that whole summer until the sisters started giving me come hither looks. They was fairly limited, except those days when the old sumbitch was in town after supplies. Then she dialed it up and kind of brushed me every time she went past the table. There was always something special on town days, a pie maybe. I tried to think about the picture on the mantle, but it was impossible. Even though I knew it might get me out of that leisure life once and for all. She was getting more and more wound up while I was pretending to enjoy that food or going crazy over the pie, but she didn't buy it and called me a queer and sent me back to the trailer to make my own meals. By calling me a queer, she more or less admitted to what she'd been up to, and I think that embarrassed her because she covered up by roaring at everyone and everything, including the poor old sumbitch, who had no idea what had gone sideways while he was away. It was 2 years before she made another pie, and then it was once a year on my birthday. Then she made me 5 birthday pies in all, sand cherries in every one of them. I broke the catch colt, which I didn't know was no colt, as he was the biggest snide in the cavvy. He was 4, and it was time. I just got around him for a couple days, then saddled him gentle as I could. The offside stirrup scared him, and he looked over at it, but that was all it was to saddle him. I must have had a burst of courage, because next minute I was on him. That was okay too. I told the old sumbitch to open the corral gate, and we sailed away. The wind blew his tail up under him, and he thought about bucking, but rejected the idea, and that was all they was to break an ollie, for that was his name. Once I rode him 2 weeks, he was safe for the old sumbitch, and he plumb loved this new horse and complimented me generously for the job I did. We had 3 hard winters in a row, and then lost so many calves to scours we changed our calving grounds. The old sumbitch just come out one day and looked at where he'd calved out for 50 years and said the ground's no good. So we spent the summer building a new corral way off down the creek, and when he's finished, he said, I meant to do this when I got back from overseas, and now it's finished, and I'm nearly done for too. Whoever gets the place next will be glad his calves don't shit themselves into the next world like mine done. Neither one of us had a back that was worth a damn, and if we'd had any money, we'd have had the surgery. The least we could do was get rid of the square baler and quit hefting them man-killing 5-wire bales. We got a round baler and a Dewey's machine to let us pick up a bale from the truck without laying a finger on it. We'd smoke in the cab on those cold winter days and roll out 1,000 pounds of hay while them old-time horned Herefords followed the truck saying nice things about me and the old sumbitch while we told stories. That's when I let him find out I had done some time. He said, I figured you'd been in the Crowbar Hotel. And I said, well, how's that? And he said, well, you're a pretty good hand. What's a pretty good hand doing trying loose horses in the middle of the night at some podunk sale yard? Folks hanging on to a pretty good hand, nobody was hanging on to you. You want to tell me what you done? I've been with the old sumbitch for 3 years, out of jail same amount of time. I wasn't afraid to tell him what I'd done before I started to trust him, but I sure didn't want him telling nothing to his sister. I trusted him enough to tell him I did the time, but that was about all I was up to. I told him I rustled some yearlings, and he chuckled like everybody understood that. Unfortunately, it was a lie. I rustled some yearlings all right, but that's not what I went up for. The old man paid me in cash, or rather the old lady did, as she handled anything like that. They never paid into workman's comp, so there was no reason to go to the records. They didn't even have the name right. You tell people around here your name is Shane, they'll always believe you. The important thing is I was working my tail off for that old sumbitch, and he knew it. Nothing else mattered, even the fact we'd come to like each other. After all, this was a goddamn ranch. The old feller had several peculiarities to him, most of which I'd forgot, but he was one of the few fellers I've ever seen who would actually jump up and down on his hat if he got mad enough. You can imagine what his hat looked like. One time he did it because I let the swather get away from me on a hill and ban it all to hell. Another time a Mormon tried to run down his breeding program to get a better deal on replacement heifers. And I'll be damned, the old sumbitch didn't throw that hat down and jump on it until the Mormon got back into his Buick and eased on down the road without a word. One time we were driving rink shanks and corral poles. I hit my thumb and tried jumping on my hat. The old sumbitch gave me such an odd look, I never tried it again. The old lady died sitting down. Went in there and there she was, sitting down, and she was dead. After the first wave of grief, the old sumbitch and me fretted about rigor mortis and not being able to move her in that seated position, which would almost require rolling her. So we stretched her onto the couch and called the mortician. He called the coroner, and for some reason the coroner called the ambulance, which caused the old sumbitch to state, "It don't do you no, never mind to tell nobody nothing." Of course, he was right. Once the funeral was behind us, I moved out of the leisure life once and for all, partly for comfort, and partly because the old sumbitch fell apart after his sister passed, which I never suspected during the actual event. But once she's gone, he says he's all that's left of his family, he's all alone in life, and about then he notices me and tells me to get my stuff out of the leisure life and move in with him. We rode through the cattle pretty near every day, year-round, and he come to trust me enough to show how his breeding program went with culls and breedbacks and outcrosses and replacements. Took me to bull sales and showed me what to expect in a bull, which ones was correct, which ones was sorry. One day, was looking at a pen of yearling bulls on this outfit near Luther, and he can't make up his mind and says he wishes his sister was with him and starts snuffling and says she had an eye on her, wouldn't quit. So I stepped up and picked 3 bulls out of that pen. He quit snuffling and said, "Damn, if I didn't have an eye on me too." And that really was the beginning of our partnership. One whole year I was the cook, one whole year he was the cook, and back and forth like that, but never at the same time. Whoever was cook would change when the other fella got sick of his recipes, and every once in a while a new recipe would appear in the agri-news, like that corn chowder with the sliced hot dogs. I even tried a pie one time, but it just made him lonesome. So we forgot about desserts, which was probably good for our health, as most sweets call for gobbing in white sugar. The sister had never let him have a dog because she had a cat, and she thought a dog would get the cat. And she said if the dog got the cat, she'd get the dog. It wasn't much of a cat anyhow, but it lasted a long time. Outlived the old lady by several moons. After it passed on, we took it out to the burn barrel. The first thing the old sumbitch said was, "We're getting a dog." It took him that long to realize his sister was gone. Tony was a border collie. We got as a pup from a couple in Miles City that raised him, and they was 7 generations of cow dog, just wanted to eat and work stock. You could cup your hands and hold Tony when we got him, but he grew up in one summer, went to work, and we taught him down, here, come by, wait a me, and hold him, all in 1 year or less. Because Tony just stay on his belly and study with his eyes until he knew exactly what you wanted. Tony helped us gather, mother up pairs, separate bulls, and he lived in the house for many a good year and kept us entertained with his tricks. Finally, Tony got old and died. We didn't take it so good, especially old sumbitch who said he couldn't foresee enough summers for another dog. Plus, that was the year he couldn't get on a horse no more, and he wasn't about to work no stock dog afoot. There was still plenty to do. Most of it fell to me. After all, this was a goddamn ranch. The time come to tell him what I had done to go to jail, which was to rob that little store at Absorki and shoot the proprietor, though he didn't die. I had no idea why I did such a thing, then or now. I led the crew on the prison ranch for a number of years and turned out many a good hand. They wasn't near about to let me loose till there was a replacement good as me who'd stay a while. So I trained up a murderer from Columbia Falls. This murderer could rope, break horses, keep vaccine records, fence and irrigate. Once the warden seen how good he was, they paroled me out and turned it all over to the new man, who they said was never getting out, said he was heinous. The old sumbitch could give a shit less when I told him my story. I could have told him all the years before when he first hired me for all he cared. He was a big believer in what he saw in front of his own eyes. I don't think I ever had the touch with customers the old sumbitch did. They come from all over looking for horned Herefords and talking hybrid vigor, which I may or may not have believed. They'd ask what we had and I'd point to the corrals and tell them to go look for themselves. Some would insist on seeing the old sumbitch. I'd tell him he was in bed, which was nearly the only place you could find him once he began to fail. Then the state got wind of his condition and took him to town. I went to see him there right regular, but it just upset him. He couldn't figure out who I was and got frustrated because he knew I was somebody he was supposed to know. And then he failed even worse. They said it was just better if I didn't come around. The neighbors claimed I let the weeds grow and was personally responsible for the spread of spurge, Dalmatian, toadflax, and knapweed. They got the authorities involved, and it was pretty clear I was the weed they had in mind. If they could get the court to appoint one of their relatives ranch custodian, they'd have all that grass for free till the old sumbitch was in a pine box. The authorities come in all sizes and shapes, but when they got through, they let me take one saddle horse, one saddle, clothes on my back, my hat, and my slicker. I rode that horse clear to the sale yard where they tried to put him in the loose pens, in with the loose horses because of his age, not because he was a bronc. I told them I was too set in my ways to start feeding Frenchmen, and I rode off toward Idaho. There's always an opening for a cowboy, even an old sumbitch like me, if you can halfway make a hand. Thank you.
Thank you, writers and readers. Rick, Kim, and Tom will be out in the lobby to sign the books that you buy. Thank you all for another wonderful year. I hope you come back again next year. Good night.